Welcome back to my channel. I'm Miguel Benitez, and I am on a relentless pursuit of goodness, truth, and beauty, and this channel allows you to join me in that journey. And so I have a guest with me today, and that is Dr. Craig Hazen. He's a professor of comparative religion and Christian apologetics at Biola University, founder and director of the Christian Apologetics program. He has authored or contributed to a range of scholarly works, including To Everyone an Answer, Apologetic Study Bible, and the breakout novel Five Sacred Crossings, and his latest book, Fearless Prayer. Dr. Hazen holds a PhD in religious studies, a degree in biological sciences, and has studied international law and human rights in Strasbourg, France. Professor Hazen has lectured all over North America, Europe, and East Asia on the evidence for the resurrection, religion and science, and Christianity among world religions. He and his wife, Karen, live in Southern California and have 4 adult children. Craig, thank you for joining me on my channel today.
Yeah, where is this Craig guy? I'd like to meet him. He sounds like... Wow.
Yeah, so...
my wife or children would never recognize me if somebody were introducing me.
Yeah, and I thought it'd be appropriate before we jump into our discussion today to also just extend a thank you to you, because to you and to your ministry, you and I met when I was in undergrad, and I had just gotten into the world of apologetics. I had this crisis of faith in college, which is almost becoming like a cliche thing now. And so you and I were introduced by our good friend Carmen Mayel, and so just meeting you, getting to talk with you, we got to go out to lunch and hearing about what you were doing, realizing that there's this thing that we could do called apologetics, and even the going on to become a professor and all of that. So much of what I saw you do on my campus, it was Florida Atlantic University, the talks that you gave, the way you engaged with the students, I immediately knew this is something I wanted to do. And so I thank you for your work and for the influence, even from afar. I would go on to complete my master's degree in Christian apologetics at Biola. And so, again, you've shaped me even from afar and what I'm trying to do today.
Well, that concludes our programming for today. I think we should stop there. There's nothing better that's going to happen to me today. Thank you, Miguel.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Just so your audience knows a little bit too,
Yeah.
we faculty in graduate programs, we end up having favorite students. And Miguel is hands down one of the top favorites we've ever had. He even sat in the golden chairs that we have. We call this, there's a section where some of our best and brightest students gravitate and sit in a big lecture hall. And he was always in the golden chair. So we remember him fondly and are rooting for the wonderful work he's doing today.
Thank you. Thank you. So can you tell the audience, just for anyone who might be interested, just tell them briefly about this program of Christian apologetics. And there's also a science and religion track as well. So can you tell them a little bit about that and how they can find out more about the program that you direct?
Sure. It's kind of a rare degree program. There are some others out there, but it's kind of rare. And we were the first and the best on the scene. And but to do a Master of Arts degree in Christian apologetics is rather an unusual degree program. It's a program where it's multidisciplinary. The whole concept of apologetics is offering reasons for faith. Why in the world should I believe in God? Why in the world should I believe that Jesus was the unique savior of humankind? Why in the world should I believe that miracles happen, or that Jesus really was crucified on a Roman cross and came back from the dead? It deals with all those kinds of questions and much more. I mean, goodness, I bet you anybody viewing this has seen a skeptic or two wandering around, and there's whole catalogs of objections to Christianity. Well, what a Master of Arts degree in Christian apologetics does is it helps you to understand why people reject Christianity, and then make a solid case that Christianity turns out to be true. And you do that enough, and you actually start to believe this stuff. For instance, I cannot not believe in God. I cannot not believe in God. The evidence is too profound, and not just external objective evidence, but even the kind of subjective evidence. The idea that he's knowable, and that I know him, and that he loves me, and that he actually does have a plan for my life, and that he's opened the doors for eternal life, to me. I can claim to know those things to be true. And apologetics just is a great assistant in demonstrating these things to be true through reasoned arguments, and hopefully living an attractive Christian lifestyle.
Yeah, excellent. And I obviously would recommend the program to anyone who's interested. And one of the big things to keep in mind with the program is there's all kinds of people with different backgrounds that go into that program. I'm still good friends with a number of the people that went through the program with me. So some of us have gone into academia, but others are pastors. Others serve on campus ministry in a number of avenues, and others still work their regular job. I went to school, through the program with a dentist and an insurance agent and all of these things, just people who do want to be able to make a good case. And the program is kind of built in such a way that it could give you what you want. I was able to switch out some of the classes for some of the more philosophical courses, which allowed me to, go on and pursue a PhD and those sorts of things. So there's this flexibility built into the program for what you want to do. So, yeah,
we actually design it for adults who might actually know what they want to study.
Right.
So they jump in, and you can find out about the program just by going to Biola's website. Biola, that's BIOLA.edu, Biola.edu, and you can find the apologetics program there.
All right, great. So let's jump into our discussion. I'm really glad to have you on because as I've been teaching, I've noticed that there are two kinds of questions that come up a lot with my students. And one of them has to do with the world of religion, the other one, the world of ethics. And I actually have Scott Smith scheduled to come onto the program too. So I'm going to be able to kind of tap into both of your areas of expertise here. And one of the things that I love is that one of the places where you've written about these issues of religion is in your novel, Five Sacred Crossings. And it is a novel. So I first read this in undergrad shortly after I had met you. And I think it's a book, maybe because it's a novel, right? And it's written in the way that it is. It holds up. There's nothing about it that's dated or insignificant now. You could read it and it's as a book that would have been written a year or two ago. So I think that it has great value. What led you to write not only about the Five Sacred Crossings, and we'll talk a little bit about what that means in a second, but to write it in the way that you did as a story?
Yeah, because I'm an academic person and I've written academic things, and nobody reads them. So I thought I'd try writing a fast-paced mystery story with all the coolest things I like to teach about embedded in the story. And of course, you can use all kinds of examples. I hate to use this one because it gives it some sort of airtime, but the Da Vinci Code, for instance, it's kind of like the converse of what I did. That I wrote a novel, which is a fast-paced mystery story with a bunch of true stuff about religion and Christianity stuffed into the middle of it. The Da Vinci Code, on the other hand, was also a fast-paced mystery story with a bunch of very strange things about Christianity plunked down into the middle of it. Yeah. So I found writing a novel a great way to communicate. I love telling stories when I teach anyway. It's my primary method of teaching. And so it just made a lot of sense to write a novel and try that out. And get this, and I kid you, there's no joking around about this, but when I have 4 kids, and man, that's a lot of night times to tell them bedtime stories. And I would spin a yarn every night. I had a lot of practice at coming up with stories, and that would transfix them. In fact, I told them too well because it got them all hyped up when they were supposed to be winding down to go to sleep.
Yeah.
that was actually tremendous practice for storytelling, and so when it came time to write a novel, uh, that part of it, I actually felt like I had some experience. But um, so this novel's been out there for, I don't know, 15, 16 years now, and it's still going strong. So it ended up being a good move. And people really remember some of uh, the actual teaching elements in the book. They remember those because they were embedded in the story, and they just ring that story bell in their mind. So I was an amateur doing it. I want to encourage those of you who have actual writing skills to jump in with both feet, because if I can do it, you can definitely do it. Because I truly was an amateur, but I discovered it was a great experience. And as a teacher, it helped fulfill some things that I wanted to see done, like people actually learning and remembering the lesson.
Yeah, it's a great kind of tool to teach, but it's a really compelling story too, which was great. And so I will put a link to that book. I know it has like a newer cover now and things like that, but I will put a link to that in the show notes. But let's go ahead and unpack some of this then. You oftentimes will talk about Christianity as something that's actually true. And
who'd have thought, huh?
Yeah. And so, but that is something that comes up. Should we be talking about religion this way? Religion is a different kind of thing, isn't it? So when you're making these claims, when we're making truth claims, should we talk that way when we're talking about religion? In other words, is religion a claim about how things actually are?
Yeah, let me frame this by saying when I'm in front of Christian audiences, very often they'll ask me something like, "What's the toughest apologetics question that you face? What's the thing that's really bothering people out there and kind of keeping them away from Christianity? Where if we could give a good answer, maybe they'd move towards Christ. And I'm not sure if I know one exact question, but I know there's a mindset that's out there. That's, I think, the most troublesome thing that does a lot of heavy lifting in keeping people away from Christianity. And it's simply the idea that Christianity is a religion. It's just one among many religions. But the reason that's powerful is because the moment you mention religion, certain ideas pop into people's minds. Like, well, you can never really know it to be true. And all religions are basically the same in that they're subjective, and there's nothing, let's put it this way, there's nothing really scientific about it. And what the people are really looking for is some knowledge, some knowledge, solidly grounded, like the way scientific investigation grounds
right
things.
Yeah,
that's what they're looking for. And so when you mention religion, they think religion is a very different category than, say, science or other kinds of objective knowledge. And so that's the big thing. So if I'm talking about Christianity, if I'm saying Jesus, he's the savior, people go, "Oh, that's great. That's your religion talking."
right.
But if I say Jesus came back from the dead on the third day, exactly as Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and 1 Corinthians say, that's a different ballgame. They go, "Wait a minute, what are you talking about there?" In fact, I like to frame, when I'm on secular university campuses, I like to frame my talks with those kinds of questions that cause people to go, "Wait, what's he talking about?" When I say things like, I think we can know beyond a reasonable doubt that Jesus was alive at point A, he was dead at point B, and he was alive again at point C. I think we can know that to be true. Well, that actually throws people for a loop, because they're not expecting me to talk about a religious claim like a resurrection in those terms. They'd be more comfortable hearing me say something like, "Well, I believe that kind of thing to be true," or "I believe that Jesus came back from the dead." That they can digest. If I'm saying we can know it to be true, that's something, whoa, wait a minute. But I think deep down, that's what they're really looking for. Can I really know something profound to be true and to be laying out a pathway so I can be reconciled with God. I mean, that's what they're looking for, that kind of security, that kind of a joy that can come from know that you're eternally secure in God.
That's right. Yeah, and I think that is a major kind of point of contention is people are having to think about religion in a way they don't typically think about religion. And I've noticed also in the talks that you give, and I recommend whoever's listening to certainly check out that you have numerous recordings online and things of talks that you've given at churches and universities, and I think if the way in which we speak about it can also go a long way to adjusting the way that people are thinking about the claims. Greg Koukl, in his tactics book, talks about language that we can use to help kind of bring people to understand that we're making claims about reality. So, for example, speaking of Jesus of Nazareth, kind of puts him in history, right, from a particular location, talking about first century biographies instead of the gospels and those sorts of things. We can incorporate language that helps communicate that. But I guess my question to you is, why should we think that that's what Christianity is actually setting out to do, that Christianity is making claims about reality rather than those more private kind of devotional aspects?
Gosh, it's just right in our text, and it's right in front of our faces. Let's listen to this. 1 John 1:1. In this text, it says, "That which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked at, and our hands have touched, this we proclaim concerning the word of life." When John writes this little passage here, it's like he wants to grab people and shake them. Wake up. We're not talking about mythology here. We're not talking about some weird dream I had last night, or some, result of the psychedelic drugs have been taken. No, we saw him, we heard him, we touched him. This is what we're talking about. Nothing else. We're talking about this. And I got to tell you, I did my doctoral work in comparative religion, so I got a chance to study all of the great world religious traditions. And I claim that this idea sets Christianity apart from the pack in a rather dramatic fashion. And I think that's a good exemplar, but there's all kinds of texts that illustrate this. 1 Corinthians 15, for instance, the Apostle Paul, in writing this epistle to the Corinthians, said, he said it twice. If Jesus did not come back from the dead, in other words, it's some sort of myth or dream you had, then our preaching is useless, and so is your faith. And he says it twice so that we make sure we understand that. I got to tell you, when you read the Bhagavad Gita or the Quran or some other, hugely popular ancient religious texts, they're not going to be talking about their core issues in this way. You're not going to make it sound like it's we saw him, we touched him, we were there. They're not emphasizing that kind of thing at all, and it's very different.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. And I think it's really interesting that it's being placed in that way, as opposed to the way that I think even Christians oftentimes think about this, where, well, if at the end of the day I was wrong, no big deal, I lived a good life. Paul seems to think there's a lot more at stake here. He's saying, no. If this stuff's not true, not worth it, but it is true, and we can know that it's true, right? That to me, that excites me, and so when I hear things like, well, even if I'm wrong, I lived a good life, I'm like, no, Paul's calling for something greater than that. I think so.
It's a game changer, just the approach.
Yes,
in this way, so your audience is probably very familiar with Lee Strobel and his writings, and his first book, The Case for Christ, is really a testimony of his learning the facts and then actually committing himself to Jesus. I did that, all the same things, but I did it at a much younger age. I was like a junior in high school, and so I felt like it didn't really count. Otherwise I could have written a best-selling book, on that, doggone it. But I'll tell you a story that goes along these lines. So I was invited to give a talk at the UCLA School of Medicine. They don't usually phone up religious studies guys to have them come and give a talk at the UCLA School of Medicine, a special lecture. But it was getting towards Easter, and the students had set up this lecture series, and one of the student leaders said, "Hey, we should invite somebody in to talk about the resurrection. After all, our lecture series goes right through Easter season. Maybe we'll bring in one of those guys who actually believes it happened." So they did that. They set it up, and they called me to see if I wanted to come do that. So I said, "Oh yeah, I'll be there." In fact, I remember driving to UCLA that morning for this lunchtime lecture, and I was thinking, yeah, this makes a lot of sense. If dead people can come back to life, young medical students need to know something about that. So I get there, and they were having this in a lecture hall, and they had boxes of sandwiches at the door. So the students were coming in, grabbing a box of a sandwich, and going into the lecture hall and sitting down, and I was supposed to give a 30-minute talk and then do some Q&A and stuff. So I start talking, and I make this simple case. I go, "Look, I don't know what you're expecting me to do, a Bible study or talk about my faith experience or whatever else, but all I'm going to do is give you some pretty raw factual material that leads me to believe, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that Jesus was alive at point A, he was dead at point B, and he was alive again at point C." So that's what I did. I just offered up some evidence along those lines. They were stunned. I was stunned that they were stunned, because it wasn't anything exactly, stunning about it, but it was just a pretty raw, factual presentation of why I think that Jesus came back from the dead. And they were so stunned. I could tell what kind of sandwich they were eating because their mouths were hanging open, like, tuna. So I finished the lecture and took a couple of questions, but then they just released the students, and a whole gaggle of them rushed forward to start peppering me with questions. And I especially remember this one guy, young freshman medical student, saying, "Oh man," he goes, "Look, I gotta admit, I grew up in a Baptist home, and so I learned all this kind of thing, but I gotta tell you, you're making it sound like it's very different. You're making it sound like it's, true. Now, he obviously was not a philosophy major as an undergraduate, so he was struggling with the right terminology, but I caught the idea. He's like, "You're making it sound like it's really true, like I can know it to be true. In the same way I know facts of medicine and am growing in that, I can know these things." And that was exactly right. But so it kind of stuns people to think, well, if you talk in terms that say, this thing really happened, and let me actually give you a body of evidence. Because really in a situation like that, they're generally just thinking I'm going to be sharing my religious experience.
Yeah, no, that's excellent. So this leads me into the next question then that I have for you. And I can share a little bit about where I've heard this kind of question, right? So I remember a former student coming up to me. He was an atheist, and so when asking me about religion, it was almost this assumption of what you've shared, this private thing, this personal thing, not the kind of thing you talk about as true. And so I share with him some of the arguments, for God's existence. And I could tell right away he was very interested in what I had to say, because this isn't what he normally had heard. But he says to me at the end of that conversation, he says, "Okay, maybe there is a God, but with the thousands of religions that exist in this world, it seems like you could go your whole life studying religion and never find the right one or know the true one." So what would you say to something like that? We have thousands. I think most estimates are like 4,000 world religions of the official ones, right? It's somewhere around that. And so, okay, with so many world religions, are we left kind of hopeless in the idea of we can't become an expert in all of them, right? How do we sort through a world full of religion?
Yeah, there is a problem in that there's a big volume to work through. Yeah, that's one
Right.
problem. And so uh, it it I did and I became a Christian as a senior in high school, and I didn't actually set forth to go through all and examine every religion, in all its detail and determine which one is the true faith. Most of the people I bumped into were Christians. That was the one that was kind of in my face, and that I had to deal with. And I think God was behind that, but didn't know it at the time. So since that was the one that was people were throwing at me, that's the one I decided to dig into. Now, I did know a few things about Buddhism at the time, and Hinduism, and Mormonism, and some others. People, we discussed these things as curious high school students. Uh, but it quickly washed in upon me that Christianity was head and shoulders different than the other religions, primarily because of these central truth claims that are offered up. And I got to tell you, I've never seen anything like 1 Corinthians 15, verses 12 through 19. That's 1 Corinthians 15, verses 12 through 19, where the Apostle Paul says, if Jesus did not come back from the dead, our faith is worthless. If Jesus did not come back from the dead, our faith is empty. He says it twice. There's many other passages I could cite, but that one really captures, like, oh my. This early thinker in Christianity, the Apostle Paul, really thought Jesus came back from the dead, and he's willing to say that if it didn't happen, Christianity's bunk. Go do something else, for goodness sakes. Well, nobody says that. That took guts, and the Apostle Paul, I mean, for goodness sakes, he wrote most of the New Testament. He's quite the guy, and he had actually seen the risen Jesus himself, so he was quite confident in saying these things. But that really, in my view, set Christianity apart from the pack. Now, that wasn't really good enough for me in the long run. I mean, although I found I found that Christianity offered tremendous hope and really had something going for it. I was still bugged by the idea that I didn't know much about the other great religions, like Buddhism, for instance, which has always fascinated me, and Mormonism. By the way, those are two extremes of the metaphysical spectrum, Mormonism and Buddhism. But those are the ones I just happened to be dealing with because I had, Mormon neighbors. I grew up in Southern California. It's part of the I-15 or the Mormon corridor, so can't help it. I always lived like next door or two doors down from a big Mormon family. But they make claims. The Mormons make claims. For instance, they would claim that that I do not have the fullness of the gospel, that I'm missing something very important. There was a prophet by the name of Joseph Smith who kind of reinstated and reinvigorated Christianity. And if I wanted the fullness, I needed to look at that. Well, they made a whole bunch of truth claims in their presentation of Christianity according to Mormons, that there were gold plates upon which were etched reformed Egyptian characters that had to be translated by a special prophet who had a gift and power of God to do so. And that would be Joseph Smith. Well, even in saying that, there's several items that can be checked out, right? There's several investigatable ideas there. And but Miguel, you probably know this, but what happens when you're actually talking to a Mormon missionary who's come to your door and you bring up a couple of questions,
Well,
that might challenge motives?
Yeah, if I could jump in real quick, I'll actually share a brief story. And it's ironic because it's actually my training at Biola that prepared me for this. So you're in Southern Cal. You've run into, I'm sure, numerous Mormons throughout your years there. I'm in South Florida, far fewer Mormon missionaries in this area. But sure enough, on my campus last year, they start coming. And I noticed that they come on a particular day of the week. Every single week they start coming. And so one day I have a little extra time. I was already off my office hours, so I wasn't technically on the clock. And I decided, you know what? I'm going to go sit over there where they're at and just see what happens, see what the Lord does, right?
Yes.
So I text my wife because she was supposed to pick me up from work. And I said, hey, I might be a little late. I think I'm going to try to bait some Mormons. And so I went and sat near them. They come over to my table and they're like, hey, can we talk with you? I welcome them. And they were very sharp. They were very thoughtful. We had a very good conversation. But sure enough, they got to the point where they asked me, you're a Christian. How do you know that Christianity is true? And I'm sharing with them the kind of things that you're bringing up. And it was almost like they were surprised by that. That's not the typical answer they get. And they wanted to kind of brush that away. They didn't disagree with me. They're like, yeah, we think you're right on those things. But how can we know? And they said to me, because not everybody agrees. And I was really shocked to hear that from them, because that is the kind of response that I get from students of all kinds of backgrounds. Not everybody agrees about religion, so we can't really know, as if some kind of consensus is required for knowledge. And sure enough, what they tell me is they had this personal experience where they experienced this sensation, this feeling, the burning in the bosom. They read to me from the Book of Mormon. And they told me that is how they know with absolute certainty that is true. And I was like, but when I trotted out my evidence for you, you said, well, not everybody agrees on that. Certainly not everybody's agreeing with you about your particular situation, right? Your experience, or at least your interpretation of your experience, right? So it was interesting. I think at least what was fruitful in the conversation, we were able to get to this point where we kind of pushed past that and said, at the end of the day, we're going to have to weigh evidence here, because there's counterclaims being made, right? And so that was, but again, that was my first conversation with Mormon missionaries, but I had heard so much at my time at Biola that I was familiar with a lot of the things they believed and the sorts of things that were, so I'd read up enough that I could kind of navigate the discussion while genuinely listening to what they had to say.
Yeah. But it's really Christianity, though, that's pushing those questions into the mix. And so if you end up having this impasse, it's over whose objective claim, because the subjective claims aren't going to do it. You both had wonderful feelings, I mean, right. I had a wonderful feeling when I accepted Jesus, but right. I was still, skeptical in my mind about these things. And those had to be taken care of before I could really commit myself deeply. And so when the Mormons share their heartfelt experience, I give them a thumbs up on that. I go, but you know what? I've had a much of my experience is even better than yours. But I've had an experience too. And but you know what? I don't want to leave it there. Right. Is there good reason? Does the evidence point in this direction? Yeah. And people just don't think religion deals with evidence. Yeah. They think it has everything to do with what your blind faith commitment.
Yeah. And I think an important thing to keep in mind is you don't have to undermine somebody's personal experience. It's just pointing out the fact that all experiences need to be interpreted. So we're just talking about the interpretation of the experience, not the experience itself, right? I mean, I don't. So, yeah. Okay. So if we're faced with this kind of objection or concern that there's just so much disagreement about religion, everybody has their own opinion about it, then it seems the best way forward is to say, well, you want to ultimately land where the evidence leads. It's not something that perhaps we can arrive at the same kind of, at least through argumentation, right? The same kind of certainty that we land in other things. But that's true of most of life. We know all kinds of things in life and we act on them and live according to that reality, even if we can't provide this irrefutable proof that that is the case. The reality is we live our lives and know all kinds of things with less than that, right? And so I think that's important for us to keep in mind. But what I think is really interesting about what you do in Five Sacred Crossings, and you also have some lectures that you do that touch on this, is you suggest that, okay, if we've gotten to the point where we're saying we have to weigh the evidence, we still have this problem of the number of religions out there and the number of religions making claims. Now, some of them you'll come to realize you can't really investigate. Their claims aren't the type that can be investigated. But you go one step further and you suggest that a good investigation of religion should begin with Christianity. And you give some reasons for that. It's not just special pleading because you're a Christian, right? You give us some reason. So can you give us, and you've maybe touched on one of them already, but can you give us a couple of good reasons for why a religious quest should begin with Christianity?
Yeah, and this isn't meant to be, definitive, but it certainly is a good conversation point for religious seekers, say in North America, where we have a lot of common interests and bodies of evidence and things that we use. But the first one I have mentioned a couple of times is that's a thing that a feature of Christianity that sets it apart from the pack in rather dramatic fashion is that Christianity is testable. It's testable. And what I mean by testable is that you can offer evidence for it, you can offer evidence against it, and the evidence actually means something. You can make decisions about it based on the evidence in the case. And people generally ask me, well, can't you do that with other religions? Well, no, you really can't. And I feel fairly confident saying that because I did my doctoral work in comparative religions at the University of California, for goodness sake. So I didn't stack the deck on this. But you're not going to find that kind of idea in Buddhism. And even in religions where it seems like testability comes into play, like Mormonism, for instance, were there really gold plates that contained the Book of Mormon pre-translation? I mean, that's a historical question. But at the end of the day, the Mormon missionary won't tangle with the evidence there. They'll simply back up and say, you have to understand something. I've had a feeling inside that this is true. So it sounded like there were some testable elements, but at the end of the day, they're really just talking about their own inner experience. There's a second point that I think these are really the biggest 1-2 punch right here: the testability, and then the idea of salvation. How do you gain salvation or enlightenment in most religions? All religions feature it in some way or another. They've all seemed to recognize that humanity isn't what it's supposed to be, and so there's some sort of redemption or salvation or enlightenment that needs to take place. And but in Christianity, and this is just huge for a person in modern North America. In Christianity, salvation is a free gift from God. He just gives it to you. What kind of religion is that? There's no climbing up, religious ladders forever and hoping of reaching some deity. There's no crawling on the ground to some temple in hopes of offering some sort of sacrifice that'll move you closer to the deity. None of that in Christianity. It's just given to you. And that's hard to believe. And of course, I'm usually talking to college students, and they really do understand the concept of free. So this is very attractive to them. They actually think it's a great idea that Christianity is testable, and they like the idea that salvation in the Christian system is a free gift from God. You can't earn it, and you can't get rid of it. He just gives it to you. It's amazing, and there's nothing like that in any other religion that I've bumped into.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, and to understand how significant that is in the big picture. Because, for example, I did have someone once raise Islam to me, as a kind of counterexample to that. And in Islam, when you're looking at the 5 pillars of Islam, one of them is that they have to go on this pilgrimage. But within Islam, there are provisions made, there's exceptions made for some people who aren't able to go on their pilgrimage. So it's not like if you don't go, then you're damned or anything like that. There's provision. And so that was given to me as a kind of counterexample. But what you're saying, if I'm hearing you correctly, it's not, oh, you can skate by on this issue over here or that particular issue over here, or we can, make some exceptions here and there. No, we're talking about the big picture. Being reconciled to God is a gift. And not that we can overlook this thing or that thing over there, but the whole thing. Your relationship with God can be one that moves from being at odds, right? Being in rebellion against God to actually being reconciled to God as a free gift.
Yeah, dynamite. Well said.
Yeah. So since we have a couple more minutes here, if you don't mind, I'm going to bring up a third one that you bring, and then we'll make everybody read your book for the other two. But one of the ones that you raised that I really appreciate too is that Jesus is at the center of Christianity. I got to kind of, I don't know what the right word is, MC or something, an interfaith dialogue recently on campus. And the Christian, who I thought did a really good job in this, he shared with the audience that everybody in that room, including all the panelists, and we had people from Islam, Buddhism, Unitarian Universalism, Judaism, right? We had representatives from the major world religions. He says, everybody in here has a Jesus problem. We all have to figure out what we're going to do with him.
Yeah.
And everyone on this panel also has to figure out what they're going to do with them, even within their religion.
Yeah.
So can you maybe just flesh that out a little bit? What is significant about saying Christianity has Jesus at the center?
Yeah. Well, I discovered through, digging into fairly deeply to other religious movements throughout human history that Jesus is a universally attractive figure. Everybody wants to grab him, probably change him up a little bit, and plunk him down in the center of their own religion. We already know that he's at the center of Christianity, but he's such an attractive figure that everybody seems to want a piece of him. And so I would actually make the case that if you're on a religious quest, it makes a lot of sense to start that quest with Christianity because it already has Jesus firmly planted at the center. And so I think that's it's just good direction for a spiritual quest. Because like you say, the other religions all seem to have to deal with Jesus in some way. I know Buddhists who think that Jesus might be a reincarnation of the Buddha himself. Right. If not that, he's a great bodhisattva in the Mahayana tradition or something. Or Muslims who think that, that Jesus actually is a figure greater than Muhammad himself. Yeah. If you actually look at the scoreboard, it's like Jesus was born of a virgin, a legitimate prophet, and so on. I mean, when you total it up, Jesus is certainly on par with Muhammad in terms of in terms of making it to the center point of a religious movement.
Yeah, one of the things that was really interesting in that interfaith dialogue is at one point the Muslim representative, he was an imam, was speaking to a rabbi, and they start debating a little bit about whether or not Jesus is properly called Messiah. They were because the Muslim was saying that yes, that's an appropriate title for Jesus, where the rabbi was saying no. So it was just interesting how Jesus did kind of bubble up to the surface, regardless of who was speaking. He's a figure of history that we have to do something with. He doesn't just go away. So.
By the way, I've done a number of those interfaith dialogues myself. I really love doing them because I've kind of figured out how it works now. And I usually focus on simply two things. The idea that Christianity is unique in that it is testable based on the resurrection claim. And number two, that salvation is a free gift from God. I guarantee I get the audience every time once I mention those two things. Go, really? It's testable and you could know it through testing? Yes. And salvation is free. That sounds very attractive because these other religions sound like a great burden. And even at the breaks, the other panelists always come up to me and something like, well, what do you mean? That it's testable. They're very curious about that. But those have been embedded in Christianity since the first generation. It's about time we dust those things off and start using them again. They're very attractive. They always have been.
Excellent. All right. Well, I think that's a great way for us to wrap up. Thank you so much again, Craig, for the time that you've spent with me today. I really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. Keep up the great work.
All right. Thanks.